Hello, everyone, and welcome to our new series of medieval archaeology in Egypt, which is a series organized by the Center of Islamic Archaeology at the University of Exeter. The series is the idea of Professor Tim Inso, building on the successful previous series we've done on the medieval archaeology in the Horn of Africa. In that series that we're starting today, and it will be we have 4 other participants every couple of weeks, as some of you may have seen the announcement. Today we're starting by Professor Alaa al-Habashi, and in February 1st we'll have Wolfgang Müller, followed by, in February 15, by Professor Allison, who's joining us today. I can see her. And finally, in March 1st, we'll have Professor Ahmed Shouki. I would ask you kindly, all of you, to mute and close the cameras so we can have the presentation, if you wouldn't mind. In that series that we start today, we started by Professor Alaa al-Habashi, who's Egyptian professor of architect and heritage conservation. And his topic, as you've seen, is about the urban archaeology and selected cases from historic Cairo. While this presentation assess historic Cairo layers through selected cases, Professor al-Habashi, away from his expertise and academic credential, he is pioneering in restoring heritage houses of Cairo. He, along his wife, purchased a 17th century house in Darb al-Ahmar district, Souq al-Silah, which is the heart of Cairo. A splendid house that, through the lapse of time, have gone through many owners, including one of former Prime Minister of Egypt in the early 20th century, Adli Yakan, and hence we have the name of Beit Yakan. However, the house went after that in a very bad shape and ended up by a butcher buying it for using it for his activities. In 2009, Professor Alaa, with his own fund and his dedication and expertise, purchased that house. And for the last 13 years, he's been working in restoring it to bring it to its former glory, creating a culture hub in what now is a neglected area in Cairo. So it is not just only academic expertise that is speaking to us today, but dedication and a true experience that he will be addressing us. So the presentation will be for 40 minutes, followed by 20 minutes of question and answer. I would appreciate for anyone who have any question to write it in the chat box here, and I will collect it in the end and ask Professor Alaa for it. So without further ado, I would appreciate if everybody please mute themselves and turn off their cameras so we can have the presentation, and we have our speaker today. Professor Alaa, please go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Hisham. I hope I'm heard well. Please confirm that first. And okay, thank you very much. Well, thank you, Professor Hisham and Professor Tim Inso, to invite me actually to be the first speaker in that distinguished series of talks, which I'm very much looking forward also to attend the 3 other talks and discuss the matter further. Indeed, thank you again for the introduction, but in fact, I just want to quickly comment on one word you said in the introduction, is that I've done this conservation work in what I call Beit Yakan, away from my academic career. In fact, this is not really true. It was really one of the inseparable component of my academic development, and hence, in fact, the presentation I will be giving today. Also, an additional word on your introductory, your honorary, of course, introductory note about the latest person from Yakan family who lived in the house as a prime minister. I don't think that was the case. In fact, I'm challenging that particular somehow false information that was spread around in the media for some reason or another. And in fact, since I will be talking about Beit Yakan anyways in my presentation, at least part of it, I need to tell you all that the term Yakan or Yagan, the Turkish word meaning the nephew, is actually given to the person and the house through the nephew of Muhammad Ali Pasha or Mehmed Pasha, Mehmed Ali Pasha, the ruler of Egypt in at the end of the 18th century, beginning of 19th century. So again, also without further ado, I would like to share my presentation, which I prepared for the talk, and I would like to get directly into the topic by explaining quickly that when I actually approached the ruins of what I purchased, I realized that the ruins and the debris belong to many phases of history. What I purchased is that the house Dr. Hisham was just talking about at the moment. And to me, it was expected, because throughout my career, I've been involved in so many restoration work, whether in Egypt or elsewhere in the Arab world. And with every context, I realized that we're dealing with a series of layers of history, and hence is the complexity of our decision-making process on which layer shall we interpret and which layer shall we keep it for others to interpret, even though we know it's there. So basically, my thesis here, or my actually approach towards the topic, is more ambitious really than just rather only a research topic. It's more of how do we interpret the historic layers discovered throughout the process, and that's what I actually call urban archaeology. It's an archaeology that is within the context of our living cities, and there are hidden information here and there that we tend to forget, but in fact our built fabric, as well as the layers of our ground, are all holding it. And is it us, for us to interpret or not? This is basically what I will be tackling today in this presentation, during this 40 minutes presentation, which I would actually be very happy to discuss it further in the Q&A. Now, before I got to Cairo, I've actually always, when I want to talk about urban archaeology, I cannot really miss that experience that we have lived in Luxor lately. When at the end of 1990s, there was this announcement in the local newspaper about a project to re-excavate the Sphinx Road that connected the Karnak temple to the Luxor temple. And of course, all all concerned heritage activists were very concerned about what was the effect of that. It was announced, and quickly enough, it was in fact put into progress. And basically, if you all know about Luxor, I'm sure you know, this is the Nile right in the middle. We have the East Bank and the West Bank where the tombs are, and in the East Bank we have the Karnak Temple and the Luxor Temple in the south. So the idea is to excavate throughout the urban fabric of the city of Luxor to recreate what was known before as being the Sphinx Road. That was what was in fact communicated to the public at the time, basically dissecting the city into two, or the eastern bank of the city into two sections, and imagining a series of bridges to reconnect the urban fabric together, whether vehicle bridges or pedestrian bridges that were anticipated, and leaving a huge chunk of the city at another level, basically to connect the two temples. These are photographs of the Sphinx Road only a couple of days before inauguration. I was there in Luxor by coincidence, and that's basically what we have. Pedestals of Sphinx at the two ends of the road, the Luxor Temple and at the Karnak Temple. But then the whole road, which was excavated, basically very few evidences were found, and all what you've seen of pedestals and remains of Sphinx are, as you can see, very deteriorated or not even existing, and all reconstructed. So the question is that why do we do excavation in the middle of a city? Do we do it for the purpose of tourism? Or do we do it for interpreting our history and maybe raising some nationalism within a certain population? Those are questions really that got me intrigued into the question of archaeology within an urban context. It wasn't only about the road, but also right in front of the Karnak Temple itself, when the archaeology also took place, revealing amazing structures, of which the docks whereby the Nile River used to flow right at their edges, and that was basically the ramp that took the people up to the temple of the Karnak Temple. However, in these cases, there were few elements of contemporary value that wasn't really easy to remove and to excavate below, among which would be those two mausoleums that the community surrounding the temple totally abolished the decision, as they have quite a spiritual value among the local community. This is actually the temple after such a campaign of excavation right in front of the pylon, the entrance pylon, and of course with that kind of huge space formulated right in front of the temple, the scale of the temple, which used to be the most magnificent, the most empowering into the city, is somehow dwarfed, because, as you know, the Nile shifted almost a kilometer away towards the east, towards the west, sorry, leaving up all of this land, and of course making the proportion of that facade of the temple a bit disfigured. Meanwhile, we have projects happening elsewhere in Europe with that type of integration within the urban context. So Winchester Palace, as you can see, of course, and most of you, of course, would be familiar with, bits and pieces of the palace, of authentic fabric were conserved in place. A pit was excavated, but then an urban code was put together in order to harmonize the built fabric with whatever value that existed within the Winchester Palace, and interpreting that kind of remains with some means of interpretation, among which would be the information panel that was set at this corner, as you can see. But since it is in a very busy area within the town, the interpretation is set aside, so it is optional for the passerby to have a glimpse or to actually stop and understand the meanings of all of these ruins excavated and put in context. Another also example which I really appreciated, which is in the middle of the town of Utrecht in the Netherlands, whereby a medieval church that was built in the Romanesque style, burned and reconstructed based on a Gothic style, as you can see here. But then to remember the roots of that Romanesque complex, in fact, only few indications by changing the colors of the floor material, as well as using the tree to recreate the scale of what used to be the sanctuary of the church, was a bit of a symbolic interpretation of a historic notion that used to be around, but somehow vanished. And for that particular context, no pit was permitted or even opened up to see bits and pieces of the authentic archaeology that might be found if you excavate in this particular area. Another also very important project, also simultaneously more or less happening, is what's happening in around St. Paul, and of course with the importance of St. Paul, which was always dominated by the builder and the architect of the church itself. However, its medieval history was always neglected, and only recently bits and pieces of its history have been revealed through several means of interpretation, of which would be this raised platform, whereby a garden was formulated basically for kids to play in, as well as a plan indicating the location of the current church in relation to the ruins of the medieval church, in addition to some information panel to give you hints about the context, the historic context in relation to the contemporary one. I cannot, of course, bypass that very important example of the Kellerplatz in Vienna, where you have a 1904 modern building of Adolf Loos, but within a very rich context that goes back to Roman time. And to me, it was quite an important and discovery to see right in the middle of the piazza ruins that goes back to the medieval time, as well as the Roman time as well, and in fact interpreted on this kind of sign information panel that was set above the sewerage line of the city, interpreting it and transmitting the information about this particular place within the city to the passerby. Each of course case had its own pros and cons. I mean, of course, in this particular one, it's a bit of a challenge to ask the passerby to cross the roundabout and to get to the middle of the roundabout to get a bit of an understanding of what's happening. Of course, and also reading it from a distance would be quite a challenge. But in fact, it's each one of those experiences to me transmit a sort of an attempt to communicate the history of the place to the public through interpretation. So let me here pause for a minute and highlight the fact that what I'm presenting today is in fact an ongoing research with a series of my postgraduate students on master level and on postgraduate and on PhD level as well. And that's why I'm actually trying as much as possible to link the practice that is happening along with my existence in historic Cairo in Beit Yakan, which I will give you in a second a glimpse about, to the academic research that is ongoing within the postgraduate level. So to me, this what we call Enami Charter, or the Ecomos Charter for the Interpretation and Adaptation of Cultural Heritage Site, is really a key text for us to really consider for urban design, urban planning, but also conservation of historic buildings needs to be tied to, especially because if you understand the topic or the meaning of interpretation and the presentation, interpretation being the concept itself of what you want to achieve through interpreting the information of what it is hidden from the actual existing context to the public, and the means would be how would you present such information to the public is through the means of presentation. And also considering those 7 principles that the Charter is always emphasizing upon, is giving such a task quite a challenge when you actually start to do it yourself, in terms of providing accessibility and understanding, in also giving information sources, highlighting the context and the setting, emphasizing whether you can actually show the authenticity of what you're trying to interpret. So if you remember, for example, in the case of, let's say, Winchester Palace, when you have an authentic architectural element, gives a sort of a reality of what you're trying to interpret to the public, whereas in the case of Utrecht, when it's only an abstract representation of what used to be here, is always difficult to grasp or difficult to believe at some point as well. How to make it sustainable, that kind of interpretation, inclusiveness, so you don't really target only the intellects, but also the public in general, the kids as well. They have to interact with their history, the history of their places where they live in, and consider this kind of interpretation exercise as always a research training and an evaluation. Well, if you get to the case of historic Cairo, and I here actually decided to introduce historic Cairo through two maps. One that is drawn about the end of the 19th century, which is the one to the left, and the one to the right is the core zone of the World Heritage Site as delineated by the latest attempt with UNESCO assistance to Egypt by 2014. So basically what we're here seeing, I'm sorry, this map, when it is actually pasted into the screen with its border aligned, is not going well with the alignment, but I just want to, in fact, indicate that this particular line is what it is here. Sorry, what it is here, which used to be a canal going through the city of Cairo, emerging from the Nile southward and going northward. And of course, this canal is not currently filled up, and the street is widened to make one of the major streets of historic Cairo that's called Port Said Street. That garbage dump area, which was outside of the Saladin Wall, is now what we call the garden, or the Al-Azhar Park, as we call it. The Citadel area is right here. Those two famous mosques, the one in black in here, which is Sultan Hassan, in red because it was about to be completed and was ongoing in the construction process, is a Rifa'i mosque. They're here. Okay, so everything in red to the left was actually under construction, among which would be those streets which were pierced into the urban fabric. Along with those, the bluish one was already completed. The red was undergoing. We were very lucky, in fact, that that particular stretch of the street was never implemented from that proposal. So what I will be focused on today is, in fact, those two areas. I will highlight them again so that you can locate yourself better. So basically, this particular urban block where Beit Yakan is located in this map, and it's located right here. So in that particular block, I've actually spent a lot of time during my lifetime, in fact, starting from 1994, when I got back to Cairo, 1997, when I got back to Cairo from the University of Pennsylvania to do my field research on the topic of the Comité de Conservation, or the Committee for the Conservation of Arab Art, established in Egypt in 1882, to select among all of those, what they called at the time, Arab monuments, those which represent the history of the town and the city, and we can number them now for about 600 within the historic Cairo. So one of the projects I was involved in is, in fact, to restore one of the courtyards of that palace, what we call the Razaz Palace, or the Beit al-Razaz. Beit al-Razaz is composed of two courtyards. The task we were involved in at the time was to, in fact, tackle the eastern courtyard, and once completed, we had the hope to get it reused, through which we can, in fact, raise funds to do the rest of the building, which is the the Western courtyard. And this scenario, unfortunately, never happened. And at the time, the building is still remaining dilapidated. At least I'm talking about the Western side, whereas the Eastern side is more or less used, but not regularly. I'm highlighting in this particular slide the fact that there is an urban block. Please follow up with me with this. And in the heart of the urban block, there is a residential unit with large courtyards. And this residential unit, as you notice, is accessed or accessible from the streets through very little facades, in comparison, of course, to the large parameter of the urban block. So from the western courtyard, you're accessing the building from a gate that is not larger than 4 meters wide. This is the distance of that gate. Whereas the facade also giving onto the street from on the eastern courtyard is equally small, but not as small, of course, at the gate, is about 20 meters wide. Now, this particular phenomena, I realized, I'm just giving you here some snapshots of the work we've done at Beit al-Razzaz before and after by just cleaning it. So we have just treasures that needs to be, I don't know if you want to call it cleaned up or restored or maybe excavated. I can still feel that excavation is actually the process of learning about the history of the building, and the more we understand, the more we were capable to introduce elements such as, for example, those the stained glasses, which were packed into a locked room, and by doing so, we realized that we have one of the most magnificent hall in historic Cairo that is, to me, is the most dynamic, because there is no one moment during the day that you have the same color scheme. So again, formulating our approach on what exactly to do in our restoration work was based on several types of excavation, I would say. And I summarized them into those sketches below that were just focused on the corner that you see on the photographs. So the documents we have in hands, that goes back to the Qaid time, the 15th century waqf that Sultan Qaid Bey put together, describes a maq'ad, or a balcony that used to be around in this area, and 7 arches of horse stables, and still describing bits and pieces of the what they called at the time the place or the makan, as described in the document of Qaid Bey. But then other documents, after the confiscation of the Qaid Bey waqf, and it was given to beys and aghas in the Ottoman army, many other reconfiguration of the building took place, among which, as you can see here, for example, the maq'ad was demolished, and with its debris, with its stones, that particular room was built. And in fact, we found all the voussoirs of the arch already embedded within the wall. So without actually knowing or excavating through the wall, one would have never really got into understanding what exactly happened during the 17th century, and that's basically what happened in this particular phase, and so on and so forth. And we are faced with many layers of intervention, which I would go forever to describe here, but then we have to be very selective in homogenizing all such information in whatever we have of the existing context, so that at least we can use it and not turn it into an archaeological site. I'm not against archaeological sites, by the way, but if we are in the middle of a living heritage city, archaeological sites needs to be put into their minimum, and basically to allow the city to keep being lived in, as we've seen in the previous cases of Utrecht, London, and others. Also, excavating through the desktop is another task, because all those historic photographs give us a glimpse on how the existing facade of Beit Razzaz, which is right here, that small little facade, as I mentioned earlier, that gives no hint on what lies behind it of a huge palace, as opposed, of course, to similar mashrabiyas and similar type of architecture that looks very much similar to Beit Razzaz. However, that kind of structure is much humbler, much smaller in size, and it's and that's basically the beauty of the morphology of the city, when you have a facade that doesn't express really wealth, or doesn't express, or basically expresses social equity, I would say. But by time, this is just a glimpse on how that particular facade survived throughout the time. And here we found that this mashrabiyya with its building collapsed, was replaced with a 1970s building. And when we have the latest law for the protection of our monuments, this building collapsed, and this particular piece of land or plot was left empty, and exposing a facade of Beit Razzaz as a monument. And of course, those monuments couldn't be touched, they are protected. However, protecting it in such a way disfigures, of course, the urban fabric of the city. And if we are to apply that kind of notion of protection over a stretch of a city, more specifically that block that I've delineated earlier in the map, on a larger context as well, borrowing the map of my friend Nicholas Warner, who put it together, showing all the registered maps in Cairo in their ground plans, and communicating with the Ministry of Antiquities, getting the buffer zone around each one of those monuments. The buffer zone, of course, is a zone of protection, where the law states that no development would take place in this particular domain. So if we apply this kind of buffer zone around each one of those monuments, we realize that we'll come up with a city of monuments, but with no people. So this is the buffer zone around Beit Razzaz. That's a buffer zone that was circled around Sultan Shaban, another monument registered of the 14th century, a third, a fourth, and so on and so forth. If you apply it on a city scale, you will come up with a city that would be emptied from any kind of existing life. Another phenomena also that contributed to disfiguring a bit the urban fabric of the city would be what we call the imminent for collapse reports. So after any earthquake or any kind of natural disaster, or even human being disaster as being a fire or whatever, so the inspectors of the governorate would come down to any historic building, whether it is in a good state or in a bad shape or affected by the kind of disaster, and write a little report which doesn't exceed 4 or 5 lines, saying that this building is imminent for collapse. we learned about that phenomena when Aga Khan project that wanted, in fact, to put beside the Al-Azhar Park also a neighborhood that would have restored houses, and they have realized that all of those red buildings are imminent for collapse, are reported to be imminent for collapse. So by law, you cannot restore them. In fact, you have to demolish them to the ground in order to rebuild if you want to use them in the future. That's basically the implications of registering a building, whether historic or non-historic, as imminent for collapse in the historic stage. So buildings like these, historic but never been protected by law as a monument, imminent for collapse. I don't see major structural problems, but of course, demolished one after the other because they are considered to be non-safe for the public. That building, in fact, had the only cinema in historic town in the Darb al-Ahmar, and it's gone. Another also typology of housing, which is a bit further developed in the Ottoman time with a courtyard or a U-shaped building, a courtyard that gives directly onto the street. These buildings also are all listed as imminent for collapse, and that's a kind of report, by the way, if you go to the governorate, that you would find imminent for collapse, and the decision is to, if you read it here in Arabic, is to demolish to the ground. Demolish the entire built fabric to the ground. So in the process of such ignorance towards the historic fabric, each one of those elements would be vulnerable for demolition. And please focus on the one right in the middle, because that's the one I've tried hard to preserve it in place, even after they demolished the building right behind it. And in fact, the owner didn't really, of course, being supported by that kind of law, didn't really listen to all what we have of all of our attempts to preserve the gate, and demolished it in one day. I was around, managed to preserve 53 blocks of that gate, and I will show you in a minute where they are at the moment. Another house also that we tried to preserve or actually to keep only, again demolished because of that particular law of imminent for collapse. But I'm also showing, beside the dramatic, of course, event that took place in the building, which is the demolition that happened only a few months ago, is the fact that all residential houses, again, had very little facades on the public street, but a huge footprint in an urban block right behind those facades. And usually the courtyard has two components: an urban courtyard, or basically a courtyard that is paved, and another chunk of the courtyard that is always been delineated as hadiqa, or a garden, or sometimes I call it bustan. Usually those gardens are productive of the needed vegetables and fruits for the neighborhood.
5 minutes, Dr. Alaa.
Okay, so basically this is other cases from all around historic Cairo of courtyards and residential buildings, showing the relationship between the unit itself, the residential unit, and the neighborhood that is belonged to. And here I have to underline the word neighborhood that I'm actually tackling is, in fact, what we know in Arabic, Hara, that is very much associated to that particular residential unit right in the middle of the neighborhood. I'm showing you glimpses of what we have already studied so far, of that phenomena of courtyard houses within urban blocks. And if you gather them all in a conglomerate piece of map, you will realize that in fact you have a sort of a sort of an axis, which is basically the northwest. The north and west side is basically the prevailing line through which all the courtyards were facing. That's the courtyard of Beit Yakan. And nowadays it's shrunk to be only that bit. The only bit that is now preserved is the one that used to be paved. However, the hadiqa, or the garden, was built over, as you will see in a minute. A photograph that shows the relationship between the courtyards and also the wind catchers. And if we get to the urban block that I've delineated earlier in the map, we realize, but after shifting the location of the map, we'll actually be able to read it now. The Nile is at the bottom at the moment. We realize that in fact that block, we can delineate several haras, several neighborhoods, and each one of those neighborhoods would have its own house right in the middle of it. House or two or three, depending on the typology of the neighborhood we're talking about. However, at the beginning of the 19th century, when the decision was taken to demolish the gates of the neighborhoods, because those neighborhoods were usually gated, a sikka, or a little pierced street, shown here in red, were actually considered to link the neighborhoods together. And here we can see that the characteristics of each neighborhood shown here with the vivid colors are usually diminished, and most of the neighborhoods would nowadays sound a bit hazy in characteristic and doesn't have a particular profession or a particular type of community that is attached to. If we come back to the neighborhood of Beit Yakan and the remaining bits and pieces of the gate, this is what we're actually working on at the moment, how to actually consider the neighborhood or the urban block with its courtyards as a historic phenomenon with the open spaces, and to interpret them in the current context. So in here, I would have the chance to quickly give you glimpses of Beit Yakan, the building that Dr. Hisham talked about at the very beginning, when it used to be used at last by a butcher. And the building was about to be demolished. 3 high-rises were planned to be rising onto the land. It's only because of my communication with UNESCO, and there was some friends within the government at the time, that I was able to preserve the building, restore it with my wife, and reinterpreted archaeological remains of 2 important phases: the 17th century, sorry, when the building was built, and the 19th century, when the nephew of Muhammad Ali didn't really like the Mamluk style, so blocked it all or demolished bits and pieces of it. That's the state of the building when at the time of the purchase. And I'll give you glimpses on what we've done, interpreting usually the 2 historic phases or the 2 prevailing historic phases, because I'm sure there are others that are even before the 17th century as well. That's our famous library that we've put together lately. And I'm not sure if you see it well. Unfortunately, I don't have a better photograph here. That we have, in fact, in that particular space, 2 ceilings, one that belongs to the 17th century and another one of the 19th century, of the time of the nephew of Muhammad Ali. So with all this information together, our in fact initiative now is how to use all those archaeological inputs in developing a new future for the Yakaniya, the neighborhood, and Beit Yakan itself. And our theme is to adopt sustainable development, basically looking at economy, social, and environmental aspects. I can just go through quickly through the slides because of the time constraints, but I'm sure we can have the time to revise one or two slides during the Q&A. Please notice that the economy is blue, social is reddish, and environmental is green. So basically, through the environmental aspect, we're trying as much as possible to enhance the building passivity or the interaction of the building itself with the environment through enhancing the ventilation and the quality of air. We're dreaming of a green corridor that interconnects the open spaces once more of the courtyards. So even if we are about to consider greenery over roofs or on facades, also interpreting archaeological bits and pieces which have vanished. This is a Mamluk mosque, Sodom Mirzada, which was built right behind the wall of our house, which was built right there. And because of the widening of the street and building an L-shaped building that is called the Suwaisis or the Sawaisa, to house the Suwaisi immigrants during the Israeli war, communicating also all of the intangible aspects of our decorative elements or our celebration events to the public, to the kids, and to the women. Dreaming also of that's the Beit Yakan location between Al-Azhar Park and the two mosques of Sultan Hassan and the Rifai, dreaming of how to interconnect them with a cultural path, but also knowing that with that kind of dimension, this cannot accommodate a hara again. That's too big to be a hara. Hara is a bit too inclusive and a bit too intimate. And that's why through several workshops with the community, we were able to configure other small little urban entities. Each one of them would have its own characteristic once more. Why not reviving notions that used to be in the heart of the urban fabric of the city, such as the hara or the neighborhood, once more revived as a main attribute to the residential units of the historic city. So once more, we're putting the puzzle together, maybe in different configurations, in different colors, different characteristics, different functions, but at least with the same principles. We're so honored to have the experience on the World Heritage Canopy of UNESCO, and we're working more onto achieving other goals than the ones we have in fact achieved so far from the Sustainable Development Goals. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Alaa, for such an interesting presentation. I personally didn't want it to end. I wanted to go on for more, but we are bound by time constraints. So I will take now some questions. I see a lot of questions coming in the chat room, and most of them, or all of them actually, are thanking you for this very interesting presentation, very positive feedback. I will start by a question from the director of the Center of Islamic Archaeology at the University of Exeter, Professor Timothy Ansel. So it is his words. Thank you for your very interesting presentation. Can I ask your views on what seems to be the over-restoration quote-unquote Disneyfication, almost, of some of the mosques and other buildings in Old Cairo that is currently occurring. Professor Tim has visited Old Cairo a year ago, and you've seen some of the work that has been taking place, especially in the Muazz Street, the so-called modernization of the site. And so his question is related to that and the ongoing project that is taking place. You give us a long ride from Luxor to comparative experience, urban experience around to what is going on now. And his question is in relation to the very large mosque we visited and the surrounding area that was located in Muazz Street. So, please.
Yes, thank you, Tim, for his question. Yes, I will not disagree with you. Of course, what's happening is a result of a legacy on appreciating one particular layer of history that is being forced. And I remember quite well when I was restoring or working on Beit al-Razaz, because I don't know how you would interpret the term restoration here if I'm using it. But anyways, working on Beit al-Razaz, and I found some wall paintings on top of Mamluk stones. And the inspector, the antiquities inspector, was very firm that such paintings need to be removed so that we show the original stones. That's a mentality, unfortunately. That's a mentality that, and the legacy of basically adopting protection laws that of the 19th century, and never been able to, in fact, culturally question that kind of profession, that kind of activity that is prevailing all over Egypt, done usually by graduates from the restoration departments in Egypt, unfortunately. There is a trend now that is being also challenging that kind of approach, and we have a new generation of restorers who are capable, in fact, to at least questioning that kind of approach. But I'm sure it will take some time to change the mentality from musifying the city and and to underline the fact that we're talking about a heritage city, not a museum, an open-air museum.
Thank you for that. Another question is coming from Professor Jan Prof. There must be a gray area, to say the least, between formally protected buildings and other buildings of heritage value which add to the character of a neighborhood. Are there general laws around materials and styles that apply to all buildings? Are there any lesser heritage classification for less important historic buildings? How enforced are such regulations?
I'll actually answer that question, and thank you for the question, first of all, but I'll answer it actually from the last bit of it about the lesser quality buildings. Well, unfortunately, I cannot really pinpoint to a lesser value in a neighborhood or in a hara. The fabric or the urban fabric was all valuable altogether. So if we lose residential component, which usually of a lesser quality than, let's say, for example, the sabil, the water dispensary, or the mosque built at the periphery of the neighborhood, we lose the heart, and we only appreciate the skin. So by doing that, gradually we evacuate the city. So I don't know what is lesser and what is of high value here. In fact, to me, is to consider the whole thing altogether as subject of protection, because it's the fabric with its intricate components that are working together in order to make the city living. So lesser and higher in terms of aesthetic value, I wouldn't really admit. To me, and that's linking to the first bit of the question now, to me, what's more important is to have the green part of the courtyard beside the decorative elements of the mosque or of the sabil, or even the the grill or the mashrabiyas of the rabah. You know, those are all working together environmentally, socially, and economically. So to me, it's how to get ourselves out of that protection that was only targeting aesthetic value and look at the essence of the urban fabric itself once more. And that's basically the research I'm in fact proposing here, and to get first into the residential unit, which usually are of a less quality than many other major monuments surrounding those residential units, and sometimes often disregarded and regularly demolished. So that's basically my reflection onto your question, if I make sense.
Thank you, Professor Alaa. A couple of questions to follow up the same one from Dr. Marwa Sliman. Thank you for the very interesting talk. I was wondering if there is a further procedure for this site preservation, especially that this could be quite difficult because of the crowdedness of the inhabitants around. Another one is regarding what from Stephanie Grant. What happened on the land where buildings are demolished? Is there any requirement to replace the courtyard and garden areas? Both about the regulation, basically, and the procedures to do it from your own technical experience.
Well, we are very fortunate that at least the historic city, as delineated by, or more or less, delineated by the UNESCO, is being also locally recognized as an area for protection by what we call the National Organization for Urban Harmony, for which they have actually put together an urban regulation. But an urban regulation that has delineated only parameters of, generic parameters. To me, again, linking such codes with the hara or the neighborhood, because you need to also delineate within the parameters the land use. So in order for the city not to have its fragments, usually its components fragmented. And that's actually the challenge, to revisit that code and to consider that kind of urban morphology once more into the city, so that the components would work together. And no, there is no law or no regulations into that kind of code that prevent building on top of courtyards. If the building is demolished, you are allowed to build up the entire plot with a specific ratio, of course, that is quite low. So you're ending up by leaving wells, but not a courtyard, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I think we differentiate here between the archaeological site and the houses that could be listed on the heritage list, which is a process that belongs to government acceptance of it, that it represents a special architecture style that need to be preserved if it is not considered historical.
Exactly. And also I forgot to mention that beside monuments, which are about 600 within the historic city, as I mentioned earlier, we have also few buildings of architectural quality that are listed under this organization I mentioned, NOH, National Organization of Urban Harmony, and that's the lesser protection And even that they have three categories: category A, category B, category C. And basically, category A is to leave the entire building as is, but you're allowed to modify within the use. Whereas category C, on the other end, you're only abide by keeping the facade, and you can actually do whatever is behind.
Yeah. And one of the big difference in the archaeological laws is the period of times that start to count the protection. Like in some countries, it is 50 years, some in 25 years. In Egypt, it is minimum of 100 years, and with additional requirement of having a specific values. We have another question about from Dr. Alaa Adamu Isa about the challenges of getting restoration materials, and how do you overcome restoration issues in areas where there are no written document?
Where there are no what, sorry?
Written document.
Written documents.
Yeah.
Who said there are no written documents? In fact, we have so many written documents. It's one of the most well-documented cities, whether in Waqf documents or in several chronicles as well. We have chronicles who describe the city from actually the 14th century all the way to the 19th century, and a huge set of photographs as well, photographic archive. But it's hard to access this kind of material, though, especially the Waqf documents. So for documents, I wouldn't be worried about. It's only just to be capable to dig down and find out your target documents. For me, for example, to find out the documents of Beit Razaz, the one I introduced at the very beginning of the lecture, it wasn't an easy task. It took me a year to find the document of that particular building in the 14th century by Qaitbay, 15th century by Qaitbay, and the subsequent published documents as well of Waqf. However, the problem is what you just mentioned, is to find adequate material for restoration, and also adequate artisans who are still capable to do this kind of work in an adequate way. To me, it's not really the most challenging issue. The most challenging issue, I believe, is to have people capable to think about how, with the available resources, whether they are traditional or not, you can in fact restore your buildings and regenerate your heritage. That's maybe the most challenging issue. Whereas I know that there is, of course, a lack of artisans and a lack of material, adequate material, but it's not, I would say, the most urgent at the time being.
Thank you, Dr. Alaa. Last question from Dr. Jamie Asnar. Dear Dr. al-Habashi, I'm really enjoying your conference. Please, I would like to know if there are new papers, research about archaeology in Coptic Cairo and Fustat. It is a bit off to the topic, but...
well, I can cite a new book that was just published by Dr. Nizar al-Sayyad. And I'm sure that Dr. Nizar, who's quite an academician in the field, would have gathered quite a bibliography in his book. I would also recommend you to consult the work of Ayman Fuad, who wrote about Cairo. And I'm sure you know the bibliography put together by Creswell on Cairo. So there's a wealth of material, but I'm not really, I don't think of recently published ones, except for those which were formulated for Al-Azhar Park, along with the Aga Khan project there. Other than that, I'm not really, I can't really think of any other reference in that domain. I'm sorry, maybe that I have a blind mind now.
Thank you, Dr. Alaa. As a final word of thanks, and let me thank you on behalf of all the participants for a wonderful presentation and well-informed. And a personal thank from me for all your hard work in preserving the heritage of historic Cairo and the soul of the city. So I know it is not an easy task, and I know you have put a lot of your work and personal fund and time and everything for that. So really, I appreciate much what you're doing. It is an excellent model for all of us. Thank you very much for all your hard work.
Thank you, Dr. Hisham. Thank you, Tim, for inviting me in that series and to be the first speaker. I'm so honored for that. I also have to tell you that whenever you are in Cairo, please pass by, and I'm sure you will see something new. Now that you know where exactly we are in the heart of the historic city, and I'm sure some of you have already been passing by, and I'm expecting more of your visits because with every visit, you inject some sort of a new energy in me to continue the path. Thank you.
I encourage everyone to visit that house, especially the rare book library that Dr. Alaa have collected. It's a fascinating experience. It gets you back in time hundreds of years once you stepped inside. So really, I encourage everyone, whoever will pass by Cairo, to do the trip. Beit Yakan is a house. You can find it on most of the mediums and social media. They have their own page in Facebook. So check it out for more glimpse of the work that we had the talk about. For our next session, which will be in February 1st, I welcome all of you to join us. It will be conducted by Professor Wolfgang Muller in February 1st, same time, Wednesday, 4 p.m. Greenwich time. And he's from the Swiss Archaeological Institute in Cairo. And he will be talking to us another urban perspective about the work they've done from more archaeological perspective in Aswan. So he will be presenting the medieval Aswan and the work that has been carried out there by the Swiss Institute. So please stay tuned for that and tell your friends, and will be looking forward to receiving you all. Thank you very much for that. And thank you, Dr. Alaa. Thank you, Tim Ensel, Professor Tim Ensel, for organizing that series. If there is no any other questions, I conclude that session accordingly.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor.